Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Hangout/webinar here at the Buck Institute for Education. Wherever you are, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm John Larmer, the Editor-in-Chief at the Buck Institute for Education. And just want to let you know this webinar will be archived on our website, BIE.org, and also on our YouTube channel at BIE PBL. I'm the author, co-author, I should say, of a book about 21st century skills. That's going to be one of our topics today. Susie Boss is our primary author of this PBL Toolkit book we published last June, called PBL for 21st Century Success: Teaching Critical Thinking, Collaboration, Communication, and Creativity, also known as the 4 C's. So we're going to talk a lot about the 4 C's today and how school leaders can use the 4 C's as they lead a school toward 21st century learning. We're joined today by 2 special guests, both members of our board of directors. Susan Schilling, with me here, is the former CEO of the New Technology Foundation, and Ken Kay, who's the CEO of EdLeader21. And Ken's also on our board, and Ken's the author of this book, The Leader's Guide to 21st Century Education, 7 Steps for Schools and Districts, along with Valerie Greenhill. And Ken's the former leader of the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. So we're going to start talking today about how leaders in schools, districts, even states and large systems can support project-based learning and 21st century learning. And you can ask questions by using the chat feature of the webinar. We'll try to get to those as they arise, or perhaps there'll be some time at the end. We can look at your questions and answer anything we didn't get to. As I said, it will last about 25 or 30 minutes. So let's go. So Ken, Susan, my first question, sort of beginning with the end in mind, can we sort of paint a picture of what it would look like when a whole school system is focused on 21st century learning with an emphasis on PBL and the 4 C's?
Well, since I'm here, I'll go first.
Right.
My experience with New Tech is mainly at the high school level, so that's the picture that I have in my mind. But now, since I'm totally unaffiliated with any organization and consulting on my own, I'm kind of I don't have a political body that I need to pay attention to. So I can say kind of truthfully what it is that we saw when we were doing the schools in the New Tech Network. And basically the characteristics that come to mind for me is that it's a totally engaged community, and it looks very different from 40, 50 kids sitting in rows in a classroom with a teacher at the front. And we all know that that's not a PBL model. So there'd be active learning, it would be engaged learning, both for teachers and for students. There would be small groups of kids sitting around and talking in teams, and they would be talking about their projects, about the outcomes that they're experiencing, about the mentors that they have in the business community. There'd be a lot of mobility in and out of the classroom and in and out of the building. But the main characteristic is that there would be relevant, engaged learning going on by all members of the community.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my perspective on this is goes beyond high school. So the districts that we work with is really pre-K through 12. And I think my vision, John, for your question is that it really starts with a vision. That the entire system, the district, the school, has about what outcomes, what competencies students in that system need. Clearly articulated, engaged in a conversation with the full community, ratified by the school board or the board of trustees, and then aligned to all the outcomes. I think Susan's done a really good job of describing what that looks like inside the classroom, but we also have to recognize the vision needs to include professional development, assessments, curriculum and instruction strategy. And actually the districts we work with take the 4 C's to their logical conclusion, which is it ought to, if you want every kid in the system to critically think, communicate, collaborate, and be creative, then the adults in the system have to. And that means that HR policy, hiring policy, evaluation policy, incentive policies could all be aligned to the 4 C's. So what's exciting to me about the 4 C's work we've been doing is that It's not just the 21st century outcomes for students, which is very important, but it is also the attributes of good teaching and the attributes of 21st century leadership. So I think the 4 C's can be instilled, infused into leadership, teaching, and 21st century outcomes and competencies for students.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Thanks, Susan. What about some people I've talked to in the past say, well, we should PBL and 21st century competencies, shouldn't that be sort of start from the ground up, from teachers and schools? But now we're talking more and more here at the Buck Institute, as you guys know, working with large systems. So, so should it be sort of school by school, or should we really try and shift whole systems? And what are the pros and cons of that?
Well, maybe I'll start on this one. You know, when you go to a PBL World in California in the summer, or if you go to a PBL state conference, which there's some really good ones now, you find a lot of committed teachers who know that PBL is what they want to be doing in their classroom. And when you ask them, how's it going? They often say they don't have the support they need. Fellow teachers don't support them, their leaders don't support them, their school board doesn't support them, they're considered an outlier. So I just don't believe that individual teachers and even individual schools will scale the way we need to have the kind of vast adoption of both 4 C's competency and PBL to the degree we need. So I don't think it's an either or. I really do think that teacher leaders who are aggressive and persuasive and passionate about this topic can have a huge impact on their fellow teachers, on their leaders. But I also go, everywhere I go, I'm encouraging leaders to be the ones to create a culture that supports the 4 C's competencies and PBL. So at the end of the day, my hope is that we have a bottom-down and a top-up strategy. We don't choose one over the other, but we address both, which is what I think really BIE is doing.
And I agree, bottom-up and top-down. The whole difference that it makes to have the strategies at a systemic level is that you've got the opportunity to have all parts of the wheel all moving in the same direction, which is a nice thing. The political realities is that it's not usually, there isn't usually a lot of time to do that. What we found in the new tech environment is that we needed to have a working model to show people so that they would believe that it could be done. And then after that, then we had to have that working model present in all demographics, everything from 100% affluent communities to 100% social economic stress communities. We needed to be in rural environments, urban environments, because people would come in and they'd say, that might work for your kids, but it doesn't work for mine. And so we found that having a demonstration model was very important in the geography, with people able to come and visit and see kids just like their kids in their district. And then they would go back with a sense of belief that it wasn't just a set of principles and some good research, but it actually could be done on the ground. Then we found that we needed to work at the higher levels as well. And a lot of cases, not just at the district level, but at the state level to change policy. So that some of the state policies that were interfering with a district's ability or a school's ability to implement this in a wholehearted way, addressing all the policy issues, also needed to be addressed.
What were some of those policies?
They were strange policies. I remember we had one school that, because in the new tech model, we would get the textbooks from the state, but they were usually a reference set in the classroom, rather than each kid having a set. We had one school that couldn't order Spanish textbooks because they had not ordered enough of the algebra textbooks. So there was a prohibition against buying supplemental materials before you had purchased all of the common academic content textbooks. Some districts had issues with the physical education and the sports. that, you know, where the kids in a small school that are part of the district could play sports versus those that could not. So we had to do some policy changes.
We have a question from one of our viewers actually on the same lines about states. Dr. Cynthia Knight asked us, what about working with state departments of education? So what about that? I mean, district level, I can sort of see how that can be worked with, but when we're talking about a whole state shifting to 21st century competencies in PBL, what's your take on that?
Well, the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, I believe, now has 19 states that have embraced the 4 Cs, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, it's state policy that the 4 Cs are important outcomes for their students. I'm not sure that in all those cases the states have really identified what supports they need to provide districts to operationalize the 4 Cs. If they did that, I think there'd be a lot more support for PBL at the state level. Now, as I go around the country right now, in the Common Core states in particular, I do believe that districts who are trying to implement the Common Core and accentuate more critical thinking, more problem solving, more communication skills are realizing that PBL is not the only strategy, but one of the critical strategies to make that happen. And so, I sense that more at the district level than I do at the state level. So I think that my assessment would be that there are a number of states that have their heart in the right place about the 4 Cs, but not as many states that have really translated into helping their districts implement professional development, curriculum, and instruction that includes robust project-based learning.
Ken, a while ago you mentioned the word culture, so I wanted to ask a question about that. We talk a lot in our work with districts about how school leaders, from the district on down, superintendent on down, should reflect the 4 Cs in the way they work with each other, not just expect that of students. So what does it mean to have a culture at the district level, say, among the adults to reflect the 4 Cs in that culture?
Well, the districts that we work with often make the comment that if we expect the students to have the 4 Cs, then the adults have to model the 4 Cs. So I think that we see a lot of teachers now creating professional learning communities in which they're using project-based learning to solve their educational challenges. We see them using PLCs to work on integrating the 4 Cs into the Common Core. The Center for Authentic Intellectual Work out of Wisconsin is working with districts around the country to help teacher PLCs to improve their pedagogy around critical thinking. So and by the way, I have seen districts take the position that they need a year or two to get the adults in the system really adopting, embracing the 4 Cs before they can bring it into the classroom. And I think that those leadership teams in those districts are wise to give the adults the opportunity to embrace the 4 Cs, think about it in their own practice, model it in their own practice, maybe even be assessed on it by having portfolios for professionals that assess the 4 Cs in their practice. So I think there are lots of opportunities to get the adults in the system to embrace the 4 Cs and own it and model it.
Mm-hmm. Susan, how about at the school level? Do you see principals and other school leaders sort of, how do they promote the 4 Cs in their work with the staff?
It was variable. We found that the culture basically needed to be addressed in kind of 3 different demographics, that you needed to have a very positive student culture, a positive teacher culture, and a positive leadership culture. And if all 3 of those were healthy, you had a school that just absolutely took off. If any 2 of them were working well, you had a pretty good shot at keeping it going. But really the most critical one was the student culture. Once the students realized that they were being treated differently, that their experiences coming into the classroom were being respected, and that the material that they were being asked to engage with was relevant to their current living situation, they weren't going back. So they a lot of times would drag the teacher culture along in terms of helping a teacher figure out how to collaborate with students in the classroom. And then the leadership would have to make sure that there were collaborative and leadership groups within the teacher core that were continuing that, and that it was transparent to students, that the adults in the room, in the business, and in the school were also learning how to do this at the same time the students were. It was an important skill.
Mm-hmm.
You know, John,
Ken.
I was thinking, and Susan was speaking about an example of in the AP exams. You know, we don't really talk too much about AP, but a lot of students are in AP. And I think you're going to watch AP classes move more and more towards project-based learning. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that. The old biology exam had simple recall questions like, what type of bacteria would this be called? And you either knew it or you didn't know it. The new biology AP exam has a question like, there's an Olympic athlete training in Denver who gets dizzy. Explain what is going on biologically with that athlete that creates the dizziness, and what should the athlete do about it. That's a much more robust question that emphasizes critical thinking, problem solving, communication skills. And when I think about that question, it goes back to Susan's point earlier. Question one, you know, you have a 20th century model of a teacher lecturing and kids Monday through Thursday and a kid taking a quiz on Friday. But with question two, you're really looking at kids working in groups and thinking about the various answers and possibilities. And I love, you know, somebody came up with the possibility of a PBL challenge where a group of students writes a training guide for Olympic athletes, telling them how to avoid getting dizzy and what kind of strategies they could do to avoid getting dizzy, and what's the scientific rationale for each. And once they're dizzy, what should they do to intervene, and what's the scientific rationale for each. That's very, very exciting PBL in the light of that kind of a question. The challenge, I think, is that we have a lot more teachers today that are used to teaching and assessing question one than teaching and assessing question two. And so we actually have an educational challenge in this country that BIE is addressing, that others are addressing, which is how do districts and schools help educators who were themselves in school for question one type education make the shift to question two type education that includes PBL and other strategies. But that's one of the biggest challenges we have in front of us, is the question, are our teachers ready to teach to that second question?
Yeah, that's a great point, Ken. I see that challenge a lot in our work at BIE. And what about other challenges sort of from the leadership level? When a leader is trying to shift a district or a school or perhaps even a state, what are some of the challenges that leader is going to face in trying to shift it toward an emphasis on the 4 C's and project-based learning? You mentioned, teachers not having experience with it, not being used to teaching in that way, but on the systemic level, what are some of the challenges? I'm thinking of, Susan mentioned some state policies earlier. I'm thinking about assessment, grading, other issues, as well as culture issues, I suppose, that leaders face trying to get a 4 C's system developed.
Well, from my experience, back to what Ken had said earlier, having a clear vision and articulating that vision constantly into all communities and using as much communication as possible to make sure that everyone understands that is the priority. Being an instructional leader as well as being a political leader, is very difficult. I mean, the superintendent has a tremendously difficult job to balance those. We would recommend that they go and find their allies in the business community, because the 4 C's are absolutely the way that business works, and business people, maybe more than sometimes educators, get that and get it quicker, and they can become the kind of the power behind the throne, and basically help the superintendent stay on course, and also help the community of educators understand that this is something that the community desires to have happen. Have the kids come out of their experience at K-12 with the ability to solve problems, to communicate effectively, to think critically, and to be creative in using technology tools to accomplish that.
Just building off of what Susan said, I got a call from a superintendent in the Northwest who said that we've been doing PBL, but we're having pushback from the community. And a consultant came and recommended that they do a PBL outreach strategy in the community. And they wanted to know what I thought. And I said, that's not what we recommend to our districts. The community conversation I think we want to have is the 4 C's conversation, which is, what do parents, business leaders, community leaders think their kids need to know and do in order to be successful 21st century individuals, successful 21st century citizens, successful 21st century workers. That's appropriate topic for a community. If I walk into a room, just to confirm Susan's point, if I walk into a room of 250 parents or 250 business leaders and I say, your kids need to be able to critically think, communicate, collaborate, and be creative, I don't get a whole lot of pushback. Sometimes they'll add a few more things, but there's general concurrence around that. If I walk into that room and say, hey, it's all about PBL, half the people in the room haven't heard of it. So sometimes PBL advocates don't like to hear this, but my political advice to leaders is to say, have your community conversations about the 4 C's and the competencies, and leave it to educators to determine. Once we know that every kid needs to critically think, problem solve, communicate, collaborate, be creative, then educators should come in and then say, well, the best way to make that happen is more extensive use of PBL, more extensive use of student work and other pieces. So I often recommend that the 4, as John Mergendaler, the executive director of BIE, often says, the 4 C's are the what, and the PBL is the how. And I think in most community contexts, you want to have a conversation about the what, and with educators, you want to have a conversation about the how.
Okay, yeah. Sounds like good advice, Ken. 2 pieces that we often get questions about, especially at our workshop with teachers, they're asking their school leaders this question. One is about, can you give me the time it's going to take to plan projects, to collaborate with each other, to do the extra work it might take, initially at least, to develop a PBL system. So time for teachers. What have you learned about how district leaders and school leaders can make that happen? And the other big question we get is about grading and reporting and assessment systems. So have you seen school district leaders work on trying to crack that nut?
Well, when we started the work at New Tech, there wasn't an assessment system that could be modified to make it work for our project-based learning. So we built our own. Things may have changed now. There might be more flexibility in some of the online reporting systems, but that needs to be lined up, because, as we always said, what you're going to count and score on is what you teach to. So you have to be able to have an assessment system that assesses the things that are important in a PBL classroom. So that's one thing. What was the first thing?
About time.
Oh, time.
Teachers needing time.
Yeah. In those districts that had unions, we had to get some waivers from the union to allow for more collaborative time for teachers to meet together, more staff time be put aside. they carried the same load, but we were able to work some of the schedules so that there was time for people to, especially in a team taught class, for the two teachers to collaborate with each other and make sure that all of their important Common Core objectives were being met within each of the projects.
Ken, any thoughts on those two topics?
Well, I would just say I had the good fortune this fall of going to Finland, and there is such a different approach there for teacher time, dramatically less teaching time and more prep time. And we have a very hard time in this country moving in that direction, but we're going to have to move in that direction. And I think as we educate our parents, or as we get consensus from our parents that they want more critical thinking and problem solving and communication and collaboration and less rote memorization, we then need to educate them to say, well, that actually requires a different approach to teaching, more time with teachers collaborating with each other, more time teachers preparing. It's really a different model. And as you say, John, a transition period in which we understand, it doesn't cost more necessarily to have PBL, but the transition of getting people who don't know how to do it over to do it is going to be an investment. So I think we do need to create some patience and create some understanding about that. And I follow a few American teachers in Finland on Twitter, and some of their, I think Tim Walker is one of them, who's terrific, and he has done a really good job of helping to explain what more, and he's now teaching. There's an American teacher who's now teaching in Finland, and he does a very good job of explaining what more time for preparation and collaboration looks like.
We're approaching about the half-hour mark, so we should wrap up pretty soon. There was one question from a participant, Chris F., asking about schools of education. Have you seen any movement there in terms of pre-service education for teachers to teach them about the 4 C's? I haven't heard much about PBL, but have the 4 C's been creeping into schools of education at all, or how could they?
Creeping would be the operative word, or maybe even too fast a version of what's going on in colleges of education. It is, it would be hard to be too critical of colleges of education with regard to this issue, which is, you would think that the next generation of teaching, which is what PBL is clearly a part of, would be already embedded into colleges of education and already embedded into leadership programs, so that our next generation of leaders knows where pedagogy needs to head. And it is disappointing as I go. And there are probably 5, 6, 8, 12 schools of colleges of education that are doing this work, but there are 1,400 colleges of education in this country. We probably have too many. But the percentage of them focused on the 4 C's and 21st century outcomes and PBL, are on 2 or 3 hands and 2 or 3 toes worth of colleges of ed. It's really quite disappointing, and that's going to have to turn around. And one of the things that, as I talk to leaders, I encourage them to talk to their colleges of education that they're hiring from, and educate those colleges of education as to the type of teachers they're going to need in their 21st century classrooms. Because right now, they're not engaged in a conversation at all. They're barely able to keep up with the current set of challenges, but they're not thinking beyond the tip of their nose, and that's discouraging. And I think the implication of the question is a great one, which is that really has to turn around. And if there are any listeners, by the way, who have examples of colleges of education that are really leading the charge on PBL and the 4 C's, we'd love to know about it.
I would echo everything that Ken said. We had a good partnership going in Texas with the University of Texas, the U Teach program. And then some of the high school models went their own way. High Tech High out of San Diego has their own school of education, basically, where they're teaching people how to do PBL.
Yeah, and doing a great job.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to ask Ken and Susan if they have any final thoughts about for education leaders in this context. But first, I want to remind our viewers that this webinar will be archived, and we appreciated seeing your questions and comments and links you're providing. Also, links from Liam Bayer, our social media coordinator, in the chat feature there. So please continue the conversation and spread the word about this webinar. Next week, on Wednesday, again at 5 p.m. California time, January 22nd, we'll be joined by Aaron Brengard, the principal of Catherine Smith Elementary School down in San Jose, California, along with Shannon Cannon, who works with in teacher education and has worked as a school coach and a member of our national faculty working with elementary schools. So join us for that. But Ken, Susan, any final thoughts you want to offer about education leadership and 21st century skills?
I'm just thrilled with the fact that people are asking the question, how do we get systemic reform?
Yeah.
Because I think there's enough points of light out there where people can go and see what it looks like to do it well, and the change atmosphere and the change energy in the student body for embracing the work. I think that's enough. It's enough documentation right there for people to get excited about doing it, and then doing it in a thoughtful way and doing it systemically.
Okay. Ken, any final thoughts?
So I would, yeah, I would. I've been very proud as a board member of BIE to see the degree to which it's started to support district leaders in this work. And I think prior to this, there was mostly a focus on individual teachers. And I think having both emphases within the work of BIE has been a tremendous improvement. And so I would say through BIE, you can find out what is a district model for PBL professional development, for PBL and 4C's transformation look like. And at a higher level, we within EdLeader21 have now created a professional learning community of 130 members, including 115 school districts, that are embracing the 4C's vision and then embracing implementation strategies like PBL to make it a reality. So I, like Susan, I'm hopeful that we have some examples, and I think that we need to all continue to encourage teacher leaders to take their message up to the leadership in their schools and districts and say, this won't work just in my classroom. But we also have to continue to take the message to superintendents and headmasters and policymakers and say the 4C's and PBL are a very critical strategic direction for education in this country. And we don't just need early adopting teachers, we need early adopting leaders to lead the way and create atmospheres where teachers can be encouraged to expand their PBL practice in a way that will implement the Common Core, implement new AP exams, but most importantly, prepare kids for the challenges of the 21st century.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Nice conclusion. Well, thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you both so much.